Hi, everyone. Official welcome to A Feast for the Eyes, an evening with Jasper Hill and the Met's Laura Corey. So excited to be presenting on this topic today. It was a challenging one to prepare for, but very enriching. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what Laura has to say about the pieces that we chose. And so we have a lot of ground to cover, just about, 9,000 years of cheesemaking history and art. So without much further ado, I would love to introduce you to my team. We have Lilith Spencer, who is on the chat box. So we'd love to hear your comments, and you can put questions there. Lilith is going to help us stay engaged with the chat box as we go. At the end of the presentation, we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A set aside. Lilith is our lifestyle editor. So if you've seen beautiful images like the one in front of us now of these artistically cut cheeses and the very professionally written and enticing cheese copy, a lot of that is coming from Lilith. So happy to have them on the team. And then we have Samuel Rayum. Sam's has a background in fine art, but is making a living doing graphic design and other creative content for Jasper Hill. Sam, do you want to say hi and give us a little background?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Sam. My education is in the fine arts, so I have my BFA from the University of New Hampshire, and then I did some post-baccalaureate work at Brandeis University. So a lot of where I'm coming from in the food world is from the creative end of things. I found myself really drawn to food because of it's one of these lively places where there's a lot of craft and mission-driven creation happening. So it sort of feeds into my creative spirit to work for a company like Jasper Hill. And I'm really glad to be here. I'll be popping in from time to time with either art or cheese backup context.
So glad to have you here. It's very reassuring to have you in the wings, Sam. And then Laura, I'm sure that you will do yourself more justice than I. So please introduce yourself. We're so happy to have you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us tonight.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. So my name's Laura Corey. I'm the project manager for curatorial conservation and science initiatives and senior researcher in the director's office at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So what that means is that my purview is particularly to be involved in these initiatives at the museum that span the collections and cross the traditional categories of art in the vision of our director, Max Hollein, who started at the museum a few years ago. I have a PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and most recently was co-curator with our deputy director, Andrea Bayer, of our 150th anniversary exhibition, Making the Met 1870 to 2020, which that's a whole other story about celebrating a big milestone anniversary in what we all, know happened in 2020. But I do think, as we're thinking about the history of cheese, it's also worth mentioning, if you want to click on to our next slide, just to, give people that visual of the Metropolitan Museum. For those of you, hopefully many of you have been there. Here it is, right before we reopened after our nearly 5-month closure due to COVID, to resume a very different but still, I think, meaningful celebration of our 150th anniversary. So very much a historical institution, one with broad collections, nearly 2 million objects in our collection. And so so I was delighted to have the invitation to do this. The chef at the Met, Bill Telepan, who some of you may know from the food world very well, approached me, and I thought, this would be fun. As any of my friends would tell you, I have for a long time jokingly described my diet as a quest for cheese. So delighted to bring together my tastes in both food and art for this fun crossover experience. And it's been great working with you all from Jasper Hill. So what you're going to see is that we picked 10 objects from across the Met's collections. They represent antiquities, decorative arts, paintings, prints, photographs, sculpture. They date from the 6th century BC to the end of the 20th century and take us across 6 countries from the Middle East, Europe, and America. And if you want to click to the next slide. before we fully dive in with the pairings and whatnot, and we'll get to all of that, just to give you a little bit of a broader context on cheese in art beyond the walls of the Metropolitan Museum, I picked these 3 paintings that represent some of the more iconic moments, from genre painting to still life to surrealism. So at the bottom left, you have Vincenzo Campi's The Ricotta Eaters from 1585. He's an Italian painter. This is now at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Lyon. This is a 16th century painting of vanitas. So you see the cheese here is a warning about gluttony and the vanity of earthly pleasures. You can see almost a skull face in that ricotta cheese. So that's one association you may have heard of, is that cheese was associated with, one of those 7 deadly sins of gluttony and warnings about consuming, focusing on these transient pleasures of the earthly realm. The upper middle is perhaps what you would most think of when you think of cheese in art, a Dutch still life from the 17th century. This one is in fact by a woman artist, Clara Peters. It's called Still Life with Cheese, Almonds, and Pretzels from the Mauritshuis. We at the Met do not have, this has been a great discovery for us, that of all of these key moments of cheese in art, we do not have a great Dutch still life with cheese in it. So if any of you know of anything, we have identified this important lacuna in our collection. So we'll be accepting your offers of cheese paintings if you have them lying around. So here, this in the Dutch still life tradition, again, there have been long interpretations of these as vanitas paintings, so that same idea, but they've been reinterpreted, particularly through a 2017 exhibition at the Mauritshuis, which was called Slow Food, which I think is a term that you all will appreciate. So really a reinterpretation that cheese in Dutch still life painting was more about realism, the focus on everyday life, about painterliness, that sense of visual delectation. So the slow consumption, not only of food, but of the appreciation, that visual stimulation of the painting, and actually potentially also a celebration of economic bounty of, the agricultural and creative product of the Netherlands. So, and some scientists had discovered too that the cheese was recommended consumption at this point in time. So perhaps not so much, a warning as a recommendation, a celebration. And then finally, this very famous painting, Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, 1931, from the Museum of Modern Art, just down the street from us at the Met. And this one, you might not initially think cheese when you first see this painting, but I promise you now you will. Dali was apparently inspired by oozing camembert cheese for those melting clocks in this surrealist painting. So you see cheese pop up in art across the ages, and we'll see, as I mentioned, more than just paintings, but I thought this would kind of give you a little bit of grounding here in the history of cheese and art. So when we see these objects from the Met's collection, you'll have a sense of where they fit in. Back to you.
All right, so a little bit of background about myself. I realized that I've hosted quite a few of these virtual experiences, and I usually just launch right into the content and just assume that you know me by now. But I have been with Jasper Hill for over 12 years now. Before then, I was at Murray's Cheese in the West Village of New York City. And so it's been about 15 years in cheese for me, which is my first job right out of school, where I studied. I have a degree in interdisciplinary studies, and that meant I got to pick and choose courses from different departments in the university, which suited me very well. I really enjoyed my coursework, and I culminated my studies with a thesis on the evolution of the organic movement alongside the farming crisis in the United States. So I have always been interested in food and the connection between food and farming and culture. And so I feel like that sort of esoteric background prepared me for a career in cheese more than I realized it ever could. Hindsight is 2020. It was the right choice, set me on the right pathway here. So as we move ahead this evening, I'm going to kind of introduce the works that Laura will be presenting, and a little bit about why we chose them amongst a longer list. I wish we could throw every image or piece that we had the option to up today, but in the interest of time, we narrowed it down to our favorites. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we chose them, and then we'll hear from Laura, and then we'll circle back around to the cheese that we've selected to pair with each work. And with the cheese tasting, a little bit about what was going on with the history of cheese around the rough time period of the work that we're looking at, or just the intersection of the cheese culture of the cheese chosen and the piece. So without further ado, let's take a look at the first one. Okay, so I picked this out right away. This was the easy decision because it really, for me, symbolizes a very early tool that humans used in agriculture to create foodstuffs. And I knew from reading Dr. Kinstedt's book, who I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute, that the discovery of pyrotechnology, namely the making of ceramics, gave humans the tools that they needed to actually like coagulate and strain and make cheese less perishable and easier to keep and transport and to nourish themselves amongst the other agricultural activities they were doing. So, Laura, tell us about this piece.
Sure. So with this object, we go back to the Iron Age. So this is an archaic terracotta strainer for cheese or yogurt. It was excavated at Sardis, which was the capital of ancient Lydia in Western Turkey, so on the Aegean Sea. And major excavations took place at Sardis, begun by Harvard University, and the Met participated between 1910 and 1922. So this was actually a very important way for the Met to build its collections of antiquities across the Middle East and in some cases beyond, particularly in those years, those early decades of the 20th century. This practice changed around the mid-century. But here, this really takes us all the way back into the antiquities in our collection. It shows you that, the Metropolitan Museum is more than paintings and sculpture, that we really get into these objects of civilization that bring us back, that connect us with people who are so far distant from us in time. You can go to the next slide, please. I wanted to give you a little bit more context on Sardis. So you can see here, if you're familiar with the galleries of the Metropolitan Museum, you may recognize this monumental column. This is from Sardis. This is from the Temple of Artemis, of which you see the ruins in the upper right-hand image. So that's one of those key kind of points of intersection in the Metropolitan Museum's gallery. So perhaps now you can have a new appreciation for it when you visit and think not only about architecture, about the ancient world, but also about cheese. And then I wanted to give you a map there at the bottom. I know it's a little bit small, but you can see Sardis indicated on the map. So this is part of that larger, ancient Greek civilization, to give you the setting for this first cheese pairing.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, I definitely brushed up on Cheese and Culture, one of my favorite cheese books written by Dr. Paul Kinstedt. He is a professor at the University of Vermont. Yes, we sent a copy your way and suggested that others pick it up. And if this presentation intrigues you and if you want to get the nitty-gritty details behind the sort of themes that I allude to, definitely recommend picking this up. So, Dr. Kinstedt has been instrumental in the Vermont cheesemaking community in teaching cheese technology to students and to also artisan cheesemakers. He really has had a hand in shaping the artisan cheese community because he's interested in protecting our sort of farmhouse cheese traditions, but also in helping us do things safely and with quality and consistency in mind, which is great for the Vermont brand, right? You have to make it delicious, you have to make it safe in order to keep making it for the next generation. But he, in the research for one of his earlier books, American Farmstead Cheesemaking, which was more of technology of cheesemaking focused, he wanted to do sort of an expositional chapter in the beginning about, how did humans figure out how to do this cheesemaking thing? And the chapter is fascinating. It was my favorite because it was a little bit more, interdisciplinary, less technical hard science. And he laid out some of the stories behind classic cheeses we know that I'm going to tell you tonight. And it sort of stops short. He gets 2 or 3 down and then he's like, moving on. And it turns out that really didn't sit well with him. And he ended up later taking a sabbatical, and he spent a full year doing a deep dive so that he could really flesh that story out to the point that he wanted to, but just wasn't able to with the previous book. So where he starts is with a lot of speculation about clay pots, it turns out. In the Neolithic peoples had figured out how to get animals to hang out with them. And there's a myth that he sort of debunks about how an early human would have, we all hear it in our Cheese 101 classes. You guys have probably heard it from maybe a cheesemonger or a cheese show about the nomadic traveler wandering through the desert with milk in the 4th chamber of a calf's stomach, and he was using that to transport the liquid milk so he could drink it, refresh himself, and he opened it up and found that it had curdled, and that's how humans discovered rennet, which is an enzyme present in that 4th chamber of an unweaned ruminant that turns the young animal's liquid diet into solid food. In any case, he points out that when humans started keeping what we know as dairy animals, they were probably for meat, and humans genetics, we've somehow figured out that we were all lactose intolerant for the first 1,500 years that we were milking animals. So we were probably at first milking animals for infants and kids to help supplement their diet. And then we figured out how to preserve and dry and acidify curd before we ever wanted to drink it. So we didn't start drinking milk for a couple thousand years after we learned the cheesemaking technique. So it wouldn't have made sense that nomad discovered coagulation because he went to drink his milk and it had curdled. Unless, maybe he was trying to bring milk along for an infant, but it's all highly speculative. In any case, about 6,500, 7,000 years BC, humans were developing pottery that allowed them to cook curds over a fire. As milk sits, lactic acid gets converted, or lactose, milk sugar gets converted into lactic acid. It naturally acidifies and curdles. And if you apply heat to that curdling milk, you get a rudimentary curd, which if you can strain it away from the water, you've managed to dehydrate it, maybe salt it, very early preservation techniques. And then it's thought that they would have stored it in a sealed clay pot, maybe buried in the ground, because this was going on in the Fertile Crescent, pretty hot place on the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea. They would have buried it in the cool earth to keep it from spoiling too quickly, or they would have just straight up dried it in the sun until it was gradable. And so some features of early archaeological discoveries of ceramics, and then as we get into the Bronze Age, are rudimentary cheese graters, textured metal and ceramics that would have been used. They found like DNA evidence of cheese on and cheese microbes, lactic acid bacteria on those graters. And so people figured out cheese pretty quick, and they figured out how to grate it. And when they started over farming the Fertile Crescent and had to start moving and spreading around, cheese was really important because it allowed them to move their agriculture with them, with their cows, in between, growing seasons. So it was part of humans' ability to survive changes in climate and their environment. Later on, we get really early transhumance developed in the European Alps. So some of those Neolithic peoples had started moving north, and eventually a few thousand years later, they made their way to the Alps. And it was a period of climate change where the earth was warming and the tree line was kind of descending down from the mountains. And so they were able to bring cows up into the mountains, or goats or sheep, out of the valleys where they would have been needing to cultivate crops and graze them up there. And there's not much known about what kind of cheese, probably very simple, bland, salty stores of nutrients, as had been the human way up until that point. But it is interesting that they found evidence of transhumance this early, much earlier than we think of when those alpine cheeses were developed, which I'll talk about later. And then we see where this particular artifact came up in the 6th century BC. So I didn't have a bland, salty store of nutrient type cheese to share with you. I kind of went for the other end of the spectrum. My best guess, and probably Dr. Paul's best guess for what this particular hemispherical terracotta strainer would have been used for, is the Turkish cheese lore, which is like a ricotta. So the cooking of the leftover whey after cheese making, a little bit of acid and heat, and you can denature the proteins and kind of collect them and then filter them out in a sieve in a bowl like this. So my guess is that that was made for something like that. And it's still being made today, interestingly. But I'm presenting Harbison because this is just an exercise in contrast. Harbison is a very modern cheese. It took humans this many millennia to figure out how to make a cheese this delicious, in my opinion, and predictably so. So it's a pasteurized cheese. It's made with modern commercial cultures that were developed to help bring the raw milk brie or camembert character to an American market, because those cheeses had to be pasteurized by law. And so this is really an exercise in making cheese as delicious as possible, just to drive value for flavor, but also in the name of supporting an agricultural landscape. So the ends are sort of the same, but the goal of cheesemaking was really focused on deliciousness more than just survival. So we hope that you enjoy Harbison as we kick things off and as we move on to the next cheese. Okay, so this was very interesting to me for a couple reasons. One, of the time period, this is, signals the true commercialization and development of trade routes for cheese around this time. And also, that doesn't look like Parmigiano Reggiano to me. It looks more like an Alpine style cheese. So we'll hear what Laura has to say, and then I'll do my best speculation about what this guy was holding.
Thank you. So what we have here is a print by Simon Guillain II. So he's a French printmaker, but this is after a drawing by Annibale Carracci, who's an Italian Baroque artist. So Carracci made a series of some 75 drawings called The Arts of Bologna, depicting street vendors and artisans of his hometown. So he was a Bolognese artist. And those range from a wine cellar to a cook, to an art dealer, to a rat poison seller. So it runs the gamut from the worlds of food and wine to all kinds of occupations in Bologna. So Carracci was from a famous Bolognese family of artists who were instrumental in establishing the Italian Baroque style. So that style is characterized by naturalism, by an expressiveness and emphasis on narrative. And they set up a school. So that's part of how they really helped to spread this very influential style that you may know from art history. So Carracci probably made these drawings around the end of the 16th century from life. So spending time in his hometown, looking at the people who were around him. Unfortunately, the drawings themselves are now almost entirely lost, but in 1646, this series was printed. And so Simon Guillain was one of the people, was the printmaker, the primary printmaker here, who did these. And that series became very widely distributed. So we'll actually come back to that later, but we'll see the influence of this carry on. But this is really, part of Carracci's interest, and then the ongoing interest in naturalism. It was very influential for genre painting, so the painting of scenes of everyday life. And that's one of the things that we'll see, I think, is a major theme throughout the representations of cheese in art, is how fundamental that kind of food is to representing daily life. Not all art is about, the mundane aspects of daily life, but sometimes, genre painting, still life painting, that kind of thing are. So if you go on to the next slide, I wanted to give you a little bit more context of Karachi at the Met. So we also have another one of the prints from this series, which is a seller of hats that you see on the left there. And then I'm showing you two of Anibale Karachi's paintings at the Met. One is this Coronation of the Virgin. So you may often associate Italian Baroque art with religious painting. This was a big part of the Counter-Reformation and whatnot. Very dramatic lighting, dramatic, piles of bodies there building up to the Virgin Mary with that dove of the Holy Spirit above her head. And then one of Karachi's genre paintings, as I mentioned, two children teasing a cat. So none of these are cheese specific as that print was, but I wanted to give you some sense of where this object fits in to art history, to Karachi's career. And like I said, do keep this one in mind because this print series was quite influential for these scenes of, the kind of people who make up the occupations of a town.
Okay, that's interesting. It was a contemporary doing, a portrait of everyday life that he would have seen on a street. I kind of wondered if it was that or somebody depicting an earlier scene in history. So that's instructive here. So I'm going to go back to the photo or to the etching for just a moment to look at the shape of this cheese. This is the shape of this cheese to me. I would have thought this would have set the title here would have been Cellar of Alpine Cheese or Cellar of Beaufort or Cellar of Gruyere because of the shape of the wheel is flatter than what we think of as a modern like Parmigiano Reggiano, which is these sort of a keg shaped, very squarish round cheese. And so that flatter shape and the kind of concave edge, that was a technique of cheesemaking developed in what we think of as Alpine cheesemaking traditions, where they were making large wheels of cheese from a single milking, and they would have wanted to make a big dry cheese that could last until the colder months when the cows came back down the mountains from cheesemaking. And they would have strapped the finished wheels to the cows or to mules to bring them back down the mountain after a summer of cheesemaking up in the higher elevations. And so the concave edge was to help a strap sort of hold that cheese in. In reading about this time period in Dr. Kinsett's book, he points out that in the Po River Valley, which is what we think about where Parmigiano Reggiano is known to have originated, they were able to really get their cheesemaking going in earnest after sort of draining their marshy lowlands at the end of the Middle Ages. So it would have been, a few hundred years before this that they were able to really get their cheesemaking going at scale. But they were, a century behind, a millennia behind the cheesemaking technique development that was already happening up in the Alps. And it's thought that those traditions and techniques of cheesemaking were sort of transported from the Alps down to the river valley, and they kind of changed it and made it their own in an interesting way. So when we're talking about Alpine cheesemaking, this is an excellent example of how challenging and sort of marginal the terrain is. And you can see in the far distant background there is a little village where there's a little bit of nice flat land. And if you had that much real estate for growing crops, you're going to not want cows to be tromping around down there. You're going to kick them out up the mountain. And so there was a collective approach to cheesemaking where a family would take the cows that belong to individual families or homesteads and volunteer to take everybody's cows up to the mountains in the springtime and to graze them on these lush alpine pastures and to actually make cheese on the side of these mountains. So there are these little wooden huts called barons where it's like making cheese while camping. They had to be pretty creative. They didn't have a lot of space and time to be messing with the curd. And so they didn't have an essential tool in cheesemaking, which is salt. They had some salt, but it was expensive and they had to transport it high up into these mountains. So they had to figure out how to make these big, hard cheeses that could last through the winter without a classic way to dry down and preserve cheese, which is salt and prevent spoilage. So they would be making these big disc-shaped cheeses that were actually the shape of the bottom of the copper cauldrons that they were using. And they figured out that if they lit a fire under the cauldrons as they were stirring the curd from a single milking, they would have, gotten the milk from the cows, put it in the vats. That doesn't give the milk a lot of time to acidify. The natural lactic acid bacteria in the environment, turning that milk sugar into lactic acid. It's another way to dry down cheese. That's how cheddar gets nice and dry and crumbly, is through acidification. So they didn't have acidification and they didn't have salt, but they did have those copper cauldrons in the fire. So they would cook the curds. So now when we talk about an Alpine style cheese like Alpha Tolman, we think of a cheese with a sort of firm and pliant texture. And this kind of bendy texture and cooked cheese flavors. If you smell this cheese, it almost smells like the cheese baked onto the top of a casserole. We're talking about Alpine style cheeses really as cooked pressed cheeses. We have vats now. In fact, we just installed 2 copper vats that we imported from the French Jura Mountains, a Comté plant, relocated it to Vermont, and it's still a copper lined vat. And we now can use hot water to heat the curd to the perfect temperature to mimic this technique of yore. And so what you end up with is a pliant texture, not too crumbly. Acidification dissolves out the calcium that would give this cheese a nice bendy texture. And so because there wasn't much time spent acidifying, because they had to get milk in and out of the vat after each milking, it's a nice sweet cheese with all of its calcium intact. You get that bendy texture and you get those cooked cheese aromas. So it's interesting how the challenges of living and farming in this landscape really drove the cheese technology here, which has been famous ever since, because it just happened to make a very delicious cheese. So once these traditions and techniques were exported to the Po River Valley, they just dried it out. Cows could live there now instead of just sheep, which are a little bit better in swampy areas. They were like, okay, great, we can make this delicious cheese recipe, but we've got all this salt. That's an abundant resource here. And so over time, instead of focusing on that cooking and stirring and that quick make and those skinny wheels that they do eventually absorb salt, but the flatness of them is to help encourage even distribution of salt. They were able to kind of make their cheeses stouter and firmer through the use of salt and thyme, because they had a different set of opportunities than the Alpine cheesemakers did. So it's interesting to think of Parmigiano Reggiano as perhaps an evolution of an Alpine style cheese, just taken to another place.
You know what I wonder too, just as you're talking, this is so interesting. And this is something that we do as art historians, is we consult historians of other genres to help, identify, things that we see in pictures or materials. We work with dendrochronologists to date panel paintings, for example, so the age of the wood a painting is created on. So we are, very much interdisciplinary too. And one of the things that's occurring to me as we talk about this is that between the time when Annibale Carracci made these drawings in the late 16th century, which were probably, again, as I mentioned, most of them are lost, but they were probably not labeled, whereas some of the prints are labeled. So I do know that this one is sometimes labeled with a caption that does refer to Parmigiano, so Parmesan cheese in Italian. But you wonder if there was perhaps even a misinterpretation made somewhere along the lines, or even by the original artist, and just not necessarily knowing what they were seeing. So this is really, interesting context. It adds information, for us too, to know more about the works in our collection. So really interesting.
Oh, I like it. It's almost like how, we'll talk about this later, but most soft cheeses, we just call them bries. And he's seeing a big hunk of hard cheese on the street and he's like, oh, it's Parm. It could have been before. Interesting. All right.
Can I jump in and draw an interesting methodological parallel?
Please.
There's something poetic to me about a print about cheese, and then comparing the cheese itself, because printmaking is one of these really interesting art forms where you're doing a lot of pressing. You're etching a metal plate, or you're engraving in this case, which is oftentimes, especially in the case of etching, is a copper plate. And it is a practice that requires a lot of attention to detail and cleanliness, because it's easy to smudge ink or allow ink to carry from addition to addition if you're not super clean about it. And I see a lot of parallels there with cheese making. So it feels very apropos to be pairing a copper vat produced cheese, historically speaking, with an etching or an engraving, with all the pressing and cleaning. Interesting parallel.
Cheese is 1% pressing and 90% cleaning. Some other curd handling along the way. All right, so the next piece that we're going to talk about points to what I understand to be a long history of women in cheesemaking. Women were definitely the drivers and the keepers of recipes, the secrets of cheese, they would say, passed down from woman to woman, from mother to daughter. It was really the women at especially diversified homestead agricultural operations who were in charge of cheesemaking and dairying. And then even as the profession evolved and scale started to develop, and it was a part of commerce, there is accounts of very early dairy maids who had a group of other dairy maids working under her, and she was responsible for tracking yield, preventing theft of milk and finished cheeses, of tracking quality, and really, being the head cheesemaker of what you can consider to be a small scale cheesemaking operation. So I'd like to hear what Laura has to say about this.
So yes, so this object takes us into 18th century Italy. And so this is when that imposing, very grand, dramatic Baroque style gave way to a lighter Rococo style across Europe. And so this object is from the Met's rich holdings of 18th century Italian porcelain. This was an era of competition to produce porcelain across Europe. You may have perhaps heard of the Sèvres porcelain factory in France, very much associated with the French monarchy, with that grand French porcelain that you may associate with the Louis, the kings of France. So many regional manufactories were set up around Italy. This one was established in 1743 in Naples, the Capodimonte manufactory, and it was known for very expressive figures, which were kind of sparingly decorated with color and gilding, so that gold, accent you see, to represent street vendors, theatrical characters, amorous couples. So this fits in again to that kind of everyday life idea, but here it's a particularly kind of romanticized, like, the dairy maid, like mentioned, that version of daily life that's a little bit different perhaps than what we saw with the last set of prints. And if you go on to the next slide for, again, a little more context and where this object fits in at the Met, I'm showing you here some more objects from that Capodimonte porcelain manufactory here. So at left, you have a guitar player, then you have the Commedia dell'arte, that Italian theater, figures Columbina and Pulcinella as spaghetti eaters. So Pulcinella with the black mask was particularly known for being indulgent. So here it's with spaghetti, it's with pasta, not cheese, but kind of the same idea as what we'd seen earlier on with that Italian painting. You also have a dancing couple. So many of these, romantic couples, all of this, very, again, light, airy, romantic. And then the chair maker. So again, showing those different types of occupations around Italy. Now, what's interesting here is that I learned, in doing my research for this evening, that in fact, some of these figures were inspired by those prints, the Simon Guillain prints after Annibale Carracci. So that, like I said, he was influential. Carracci was influential very much in the spread of the Italian Baroque style, as well as an interest in that kind of realism, naturalism. But those very prints had a long history and broad influence, not only in two-dimensional art, but here, of course, we're going into the genre of the decorative arts, and they had an influence there as well.
Right. So I've paired the cheese Sherry Gray with this piece, partially because the cheese that the girl is holding here, it looks like a natural rind cheese, maybe a small tome, and sprinkling soot from the fireplace onto a finished cheese was one way of kind of keeping the flies away, but it also is alkaline in nature. It helps temper that acidic surface of a freshly made cheese and helps a nice rind to develop. So I thought to myself, gosh, that could be an ash ripened cheese. And women would have been making particularly this type of cheese. I like the juxtaposition of these two images. So the Middle Ages saw a lot of development of cheese making technique and some diversification. The period that Dr. Kinstedt calls that the murky Middle Ages, where we're not quite sure what happened, but they were definitely making and eating cheese, and they sort of came out the other side. Records show that there was a lot more cheeses than before, and the age of diversification really took off around this time. That these figures would have been made. So the sort of gelling of what we think of as modern cheeses that are still on the market today in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. That's where Gruyere came about with the name Gruyere and Comté. So these would have been earlier than the making of the porcelain, but it's really, it points to how these cheeses sort of developed out of the concept of a soft cheese. So a soft cheese was not meant to transport, to put on a boat or on a mule and take far away. These were really meant to feed the local community and a local family. So a woman managing a diversified homestead, I love this, that she looks exhausted. She's got a lot going on. She's probably making candles and chasing chickens and making cheese. And they would have had maybe a cow for the family if they were lucky, maybe a couple goats. And cows were making a lot less cheese back then. So the milk from one cow for a day would maybe make a half pound of cheese. Basically, that Sherry Gray. That's a lot of work to go through for a half pound of cheese. The collection, the coagulation, the draining, and the post work. So she would have been a lot more likely to let her milk sit and collect until she had sort of enough milk to make cheese making worth it every few days. So make a few pounds of cheese, maybe a few small cheeses, enough to have at dinner a few nights a week. And so when you let milk sit, it's fully acidifying. So nowadays we call these lactic set cheeses or hand ladled cheese, and you tend to get a texture like this Sherry Gray. I've got a younger one on my desk here. This is not quite a fully lactic set hand ladled cheese, but it's definitely more in that direction than other cheeses that we make. If you've ever had Seltzer, Valençay, Boucheron, these are lightly aged, often ash goat cheeses that originated in the Loire Valley from a homestead cheesemaker like this. And they have this kind of cakey texture. We call it a short texture, sort of fluffy on the inside, and then it gets gooey around the edge. So that happens when you let milk sit for a long time, fully acidifies and kind of coagulates with very, very little rennet addition. So this would have happened nearly spontaneously. She would have ended up maybe with a wooden vat full of a few days worth of milk, and that vat would have had natural lactic acid bacteria, the starter culture that would be needed, and she would end up with yogurt at a certain point. She would ladle the yogurt out into little maybe wicker baskets or ceramic forms with perforations to drain, put a good amount of salt on them, some soot from the fireplace, and then she put it in her basement. This wouldn't fly down in hotter regions. There wouldn't have been a suitable, cool 55-degree root cellar for these cheeses to age out gracefully. So at the cellars of Jasper Hill, we built these underground cheese vaults, and we built them underground because the resting temperature beneath the frost line is just about 50 degrees year round. We're mimicking a root cellar of the Loire Valley where these cheeses discovered their rind microbes before refrigeration technology. So we're trying to recreate that magic today. So her setup and her busy life would have pushed her cheesemaking in that direction. And around the same time, maybe a bit earlier, we have monastic traditions. So monks invented the 8-hour workday, especially the Benedictine monks are credited with this, where they would have 4 hours of work after morning prayer, then they'd have a banquet type lunch and do some more praying, and then they'd have 4 more hours of work in the afternoon. And they had people working for them. They had laymen. So this cheesemaking monk, they got specialized. There's a blacksmith monk and a vegetable growing monk, and then there's the cheese guy. And the cheese guy would finish with morning prayer, and his cows would already be milked by the layman, and his milk would be in the vat, and he'd be ready to go. So not a lot of acid production. So kind of a squidgier cheese, less crumbly. And he'd be making banquet sized cheeses, right? He's less interested in a little half-pound of cheese that you could have for dinner with your small family, and more with a big wheel of cheese you'd put on a long table to have with your monk buddies at your banquet lunch. So he'd be making that size of cheese, less acid driven. And then he'd get milk in and out of the vat pretty quick in that 4-hour period. He had to get to lunch. Then in the afternoon, cheese making is done for the day. The afternoon milking would probably have been combined with the morning milking. He's not going to have to deal with milk again. So he's got sort of 4 hours to kill, but he's got to be busy. So he would go into the cellar of the abbey and tend to his cheeses. And so whereas the French cheesemaker, French housewife, would have thrown ash on the cheese and let it be, he's down there like, what can I do to bring you along? And he's seeing mold grow. The same molds that would have been growing, or flora that would have been growing on a sherry gray. And he's thinking to himself, this doesn't seem too holy. I'm a purist. I'm going to wash that off with beer, salted water, any like safe potable liquid he had around, spirits perhaps. And that created what we know as the washed rind cheese style. So washed rind bacteria and yeast, the orange sticky cultures that grow on a soft washed rind cheese like a Poisse or Willoughby, those are less acid tolerant, which worked for the monk. And they only develop when you keep the rind very well hydrated. And so it's interesting that their, religious beliefs, the organization of their day, and the specialization in their work really led to a major split in the soft cheese family between those bloomy rinds and those washed rinds. Okay. So this is a compelling image. It's sort of one of those, perhaps it's satire. Cheese and satire, I think, is a running theme in art. And it's maybe one of those warnings about gluttony, but also it's an everyday item. Man can't live on bread alone. He needs cheese and smooches too, right? So take it away, Laura.
Absolutely. And, I was thinking of what you were talking about with the, the tradition, the monastic traditions and whatnot with cheese, that's another layer of association that sometimes cheese has in art. Of course, not so much in this image, but in other works of art, cheese was often one of those things you were supposed to give up for Lent in the Christian tradition. So sometimes the representation of cheese is sort of the, forbidden fruit or, indulgence in reaction to the idea of a more ascetic lifestyle of giving up those kinds of things. And then at other times, so sometimes cheese was that kind of representation of sin and indulgence. And then it had, associations with sex and other kinds of indulgence. But then also in moments in the Dutch still life tradition, for example, like that Clara Peters still life that I showed at the beginning, sometimes cheese was associated, that painting, cheese has been interpreted as being a sign of purity, of chastity, of motherhood, so it's interesting how, there are all of these different layers from the economic to the religious to the social that can kind of accumulate onto the interpretations of these different objects. And of course, sometimes we don't entirely know, these are different readings from different people. So now we've moved into the golden age of British caricature during the Georgian era. And I'm going to show you 2 different prints, both by Thomas Rowlandson, one of the important printmakers of this genre, who was known both for social, but really particularly for social, as well as political satire. And we will see one of each of those here. So the first one, as you see, is called Bachelor's Fare: Bread, Cheese, and Kisses. And this is, a humorous scene of courtship where the staples of life, this is what we're talking about here, are, bread, cheese, and kisses. So you need, some good food and some love, and there you go. And in fact, it's not just in the title that you see at the bottom of the print, the caption there, but it's actually reiterated on that little print on the wall behind the couple. So it's repeated there. If you can, I don't know, make your screen big enough or zoom in to see it. But what I love here is that, not only do you have this, kind of body couple with the woman, between the legs of the man sitting on that chair, but so you have cheese on the table behind them, this wheel of cheese. And I love that it's attracting, very much attention from that dog who's almost like salivating, climbing up onto the table. So, that parallel kind of created again between love and indulgence in food. So definitely a satire here. I think in this case, a little more humor, not so much of a, that heavy-handed kind of warning, but the staples of life, the pleasures of life here. And why don't we go on to the other one for a point of comparison? So this is the downfall of monopoly in 1800, much more political, kind of serious sounding satire. So what you have going on here is you have Death, the skeleton, chasing the monopolizers who are trying to flee with basic supplies. And this is where cheese comes in. So it's probably too small to see unless, depending on how big your screen is. But at the lower left there, these, again, various staples of life are labeled. So bacon, sugar, cheese, and hops are all labeled in the lower left. And Death is chasing these monopolizers who are taking these staples down the road to hell. Behind this chase scene, there's a scene of celebration around the statue of Britannia. And at right, there's this scene of women and children kind of rejoicing around this piece of bread that they have gotten. So what you see here is a play on imagery of the destruction of mankind taken from the book of Revelations. So the idea of death as a skeleton chasing people down the road to hell. That is, there are many different interpretations of this throughout the history of art. And so the reason that they're thinking about monopoly in this moment is that, monopolies played a very important role in the establishment of the British Empire, particularly the East India Company. And of course, we can think about, the important role that monopoly had in the reactions that led to the American Revolution. So it was really a little bit later, but this is in the early moments of British Parliament beginning to strip the East India Company of some of its privileges of monopoly. So this is that political commentary on, kind of economic, the economic situation. But as always in this genre, done very much through this lens of satire, of humor, and of this kind of imagery that relates to other, sources in art. So here again, in a social satire and in a political satire, cheese is representative of something that is fundamental to life, that is a staple of the economy, but also, to a little bit of that indulgence and the happiness of life, much like love.
Right. So that's a chaotic scene. It's what happens when you fly a little too close to the sun in your pursuit of commerce and commodification of what should really just be accessible to all. And I think this is a time in the United States and in the British Isles where urbanization is happening and people are becoming more separated from the making of their food, and necessarily so there have to be companies and intermediaries making those connections, and that's hard to do in a just and equitable way, we'll say, and in a savvy way, considering how much political tumult was happening at the time. So this is an interesting segue into talking about traditional style cheddars. Cheshire cheesemaking was probably the most popular cheese from the British countryside. And in New England, a lot of cheesemakers moved from the British Isles to New England, brought Cheshire cheesemaking with them. And that's really what was transported sort of medium distances and enjoyed in like local towns. It's still around today. It's sort of like a cheddar, but a little less sturdy. And there's an interesting section in Kinstead's book where he talks about how the cheesemongers had an important role to play in connecting the cheesemakers with the commerce with the people in the city, and they took ownership of the cheeses at kind of a halfway point, and then they would wait for ships to come in, and then they would load up the bellies of these ships with their cheeses, and then they would go and sell them under their name in the cities. And those ships would only come ever so often, and you couldn't quite predict when you'd be able to get your freight on board. And so Cheshire cheeses were drying out, and by the time they were getting to cities, they were sort of falling apart. They were losing a lot of weight, and if you're buying and selling by the pound, that's no good. So the convention of wrapping a cheese with cloth and rubbing it with butter or lard was developed as a way to help preserve it better and slow down that cheese making. And also the technique and the behind the making of a cheddar is resulted in a little bit sturdier cheese than a Cheshire, which is a little bit flakier and more delicate and more prone to drying. Cheshire these days has kind of become a bandage wrap cheese. It's sort of taken a cue from cheddar, but cheddar was sort of a solution to this. Like, how could we make this a sturdier cheese? These cheeses were being made at scale as opposed to at the farmhouse level. There was when we think about farmhouse cheeses of the British Isles, we think about these kind of large format milled curd cheeses where they crumble the curd up into small pieces, directly salt them, and pack them into these well-transportable keg-shaped finished cheeses. They actually had a very rich farmhouse tradition, but when urbanization happened, it happened in such a way that the manors sort of were left holding the bag as people were like, I'm all set, man. I'm going to go work in a shirt factory instead of being your like indentured farm servant. So they had to get more efficient with less labor in the making of cheeses. There was also a population boom going on in the middle of the 1800s, and England lowered tariffs in order to encourage imports from New England. So there is a crazy amount of cheese being exported from the United States to London in particular in the middle of the 1800s. The first cheese factory got built in Rome, New York in 1851. The scientific method was being applied to cheese for the first time by a gentleman in London, and an American entrepreneur went over and was like, you've got cool ideas about like ensuring salability and consistency and sort of how to industrialize cheese. And he took that knowledge back to the US, and the cheese factory exploded. This is around the time the Erie Canal was built, which allowed westward movement of farming and the ability to get food down into population centers with more readily available farmland out west. So in 1859, the US sent 5 million pounds of cheese to the UK. Less than 10 years later, in 1863, it was 50 million pounds. Like, the demand was crazy, and they're building these cheese factories to meet this metropolitan demand. And they went a little bit overboard and sort of overextended themselves, made too much cheese, actually. They topped out at around 100. By 1874, they had 100 million pounds being exported to the UK. And that's when prices started to fall because they were making more than the market could absorb. And so they started doing weird things like skimming off butter to also make butter and cheese. And they started making what were called filled cheeses, where they were taking lard, like cheaper fat, and figuring out how to process it in a way that it would stay suspended in milk. And they were sort of artificially beefing up their cheeses, but it wasn't good. Like, it did not result in a delicious cheese. And so although they topped out in 148 million pounds of cheese in 1881, they had ruined their reputation by kind of flying too close to the sun and trying to just make cheese as inexpensively as possible in order to drive down the cost of production, because those prices were falling. And they totally got usurped by cheeses made in like the other new colonies like Australia and Canada and New Zealand, and we never recovered that market. It was a negligible amount, by the year 1900, and today remains negligible in the grand scheme of things. We've ruined our reputation for cheese ever since, and in the United States, we kind of lost that market. And it became sort of a race to the bottom in a way in terms of quality. We got really good at making cheese inexpensively per pound, but at the expense of an interesting cheese. So we figured out how to sell it younger, but not with enough time to really develop flavor. So cheese technology was used to decrease cost of production, but not to increase quality. And that's why I think we have a reputation for making boring cheese today. An interesting point, we think about this bandaged cheddar as being an innovation of the UK, because today the British bandaged cheddars are the most famous in the world, and were being imported until the early 2000s. And they were the only cloth-bound cheddars available. Cabot cloth-bound was made in collaboration with the biggest cheesemaker in the state, been making cheese since 1919, and Jasper Hill, who was willing to do the laborious bandage wrapping and flora growing on the outside. Cabot wasn't going to try to grow flora on anything. So we collaborated on that cheese, and it was sort of like, now America has this cloth-bound cheddar. But Kinstead thinks it was possible that American cheesemakers actually developed that cloth wrapping technique in order to protect their cheese and get it on, transatlantic travel. So it may have been the Americans who invented that style, and then we just forgot about it once we industrialized. But Cabot cloth-bound is definitely is made with a nod to those traditional cheeses, but with kind of a sweeter flavor profile that's definitely designed to appeal to the American market. So I'll talk a little bit more about cheddar in a future slide, but at this point we'll move on to what we couldn't resist as just the prototypical still life with cheese. So you've got one in the collection, right? Tell us about it.
We do. So while it is not a Dutch still life from that kind of golden age of Dutch painting, what we do have here is a late 19th century still life with cheese by the artist Antoine Volant. So this is the first painting we're seeing from the Met's collection tonight. It very much carries on that tradition of Dutch still life painting with cheese. But this artist is just a little bit older than Manet and the Impressionists, but basically a contemporary of theirs. And this painting from the late 1870s is itself contemporary with those early years of Impressionism. So if you think about those light and airy Impressionist pictures, this one appears quite dark and more of that brown painting genre by comparison. So Volant was not part of the avant-garde of the time. He was more interested in looking back, particularly to Chardin, who was one of the iconic genre painters of the whole history of genre painting, an 18th century French painter, also kind of picking up on the Dutch still life tradition as well as Spanish. And this painting shows hallmarks of all of these kind of different styles. It has a very painterly nature, though, and I think that what's great about this one is that you see that so much in the Wheel of Cheese itself. Probably the artist used a palette knife here. Which is kind of interesting when you're thinking about eating, cutting cheese with a knife and actually applying paint to give it that much of a texture. So that's something that you can see, that real interest in showing the texture of the paint itself. It's something that adds a very sensual quality to the cheese, to the food. Again, thinking to that analogy of slow food and the slow visual appreciation of art. This is something that's meant to really captivate your eye, to draw you in, to appreciate it in a sensual way. It's also something that's meant to draw attention to the hand of the painter. And that's where we kind of cross over into seeing something similar to what the Impressionists were doing at the time, with that idea of kind of capturing what a glimpse would look like, and really capturing the surface of the picture and painting. So you see a real technical virtuosity here in the rendering of texture, in light, as well as, again, that interest in everyday objects and realism. So this is not long after the heyday of Courbet, he's still painting, but Courbet really drew attention to daily life, particularly in rural France, where he was not just looking at the more popular genres of history painting, of military painting, of mythological painting, the ones that were celebrated in the official salon, but looking at the art of the everyday, the art of the people. So here, I think what we can see from this Volant painting is looking at that in still life. This is not, meant to be a fancy table. You get that sense from the setting and from the very humble, walls with their kind of texture there, the humble objects on the table itself. But one that's meant to sort of to suggest that even when you're looking at something humble, there's a real beauty in it, and that can be brought out by the painter, as well as that, those effects of light. That particularly has a little bit of that Spanish feel in this picture. So we have a pair here. If you want to go on to the next one. So moving us forward in time, but again, looking at Brie, and this one we have labeled on the photograph itself. So this is a photograph by Andre Cortèche, which doesn't really have a title, but is given a title based on what we see. Le Délicieux is like the brand of real, véritable, real Brie cheese. So Cortèche was a Hungarian-born photographer. He then served briefly in World War I and moved to Paris, which was then, of course, the capital of the art world, in 1925, and then moved to New York City in 1936 because of the persecution of Jewish people leading up to World War II. So this was, we think maybe created around, the later perhaps part of the time when he was in Paris, but certainly is from his Paris period. This is when he became an acclaimed photographer, both commercially successful as well as critically successful. He was the first photographer to have a one-man show of his work. So he's one of these seminal figures in photojournalism. Also, in a slightly different way, but really interested in the everyday. So he captured the streets of Paris. He captured cafe culture. Interestingly, many of his scenes of outdoor the streets of Paris are quieter, have that kind of haunting, more like a nighttime quality. Whereas he also captured the bustle of cafe life. And I think that's where this photograph fits in. It's part of that, exchange where you have this man cutting a piece of cheese for that very well-dressed woman who is standing there at his counter. So what Cortèche was known for as well is he had a real interest in gesture. So that gesture of cutting and serving the cheese is right there in the middle of the image. That's important here, in shapes and geometry. And so if you look at what's on the table, the shapes that you have, the squares and the circles, that's an important part of his work, as well as capturing things from kind of unusual angles. So we're, as a little bit of a high pitch on this image, and, makes you think, where are we? Who are we? How are we looking in on this scene? It gives you kind of a sense of peering in and over the scene there. He works for magazines in Paris, so that's where a lot of his photographs were published. He was very much a part of that French bohemian scene. He was friends with artists like Mondrian and Man Ray. So some of his interest in geometries may have come from also his interest in cubism, which he was seeing there a little later than when it was first debuted. But here, I think, again, it's, these different interpretations of the essential quality of cheese, and of course bringing us to France, here, cheese in France, that quintessential French cheese, whether we're looking at it in the cosmopolitan context, we're here in this shop in Paris with these handsomely dressed people, or in a quieter, perhaps, rural scene outside the city, not quite so well-heeled, but still just as essential to that, that work of art.
Brie, it's so iconic in the still life as that, everyday moment, in the casual table that you might have seen in the corner of a kitchen, to this moment. I love that you mentioned gesture, because that gesture of handing somebody a piece of cheese is so important to the modern artisan cheese movement. We rely so heavily on the cheesemonger to hand that piece of cheese over the counter and to tell that story and to help make that connection from the countryside to the person who's going to eat the cheese and be nourished by it. Cheesemongering in the United States is alive and well. It's a whole subculture, and it looks a little bit different than this gentleman wearing the tie. Although these crazy cats are probably doling out and handing over a taste of authentic, beautiful bries or brie style cheeses. So these are a few scenes from the Cheesemonger Invitational, which is a very contemporary thing going on. The guy up at the top, Mr. Moo, that's Adam Moskowitz. He took over his dad's importing and cheese sort of deconsolidation company. So they collect imports of particularly European cheeses and make them available for pickup in New York City, where distributors and wholesalers from all over the country come and they, grab cases from different importers and build you your palette of what you ordered. And they serve a really important role. And very cleverly, Adam saw the importance of mongers and of celebrating that work, which is often done by young people who have an interest in food and culture and in knowing where their food comes from and are driven to be those storytellers and those people making that connection beyond a paycheck or any other pursuit that they could have gone with what's usually a liberal arts education. So in the upper right hand corner, that's Jill, just joined our team, winner of the Cheesemonger Invitational. This is Mateo, the owner of our company, on a trade show where we were doing a lot of business, had a lot going on, but this was the highlight of the trip and extremely important for him to personally be there. And our friend and fellow Vermonter and a local cheese shop, Rory Stamp, won the competition that year. And that's his partner, Rosie, who was one of our cheesemakers at the time. So this cultural scene is really important for us, not only because it gives us life and purpose and is really fun to be a part of, but it's, like I said, these are the people who are building the culture now. And it's just, I love the juxtaposition between those sort of buttoned up roots of the profession. But it is truly a profession that is celebrated. And the winner of the Cheesemonger Invitational has the opportunity to go to France and compete in an international cheesemongering competition where every country has their sort of own personality and approach. So Moses Sleeper is clearly the cheese that I've chosen here. Is this a brie? Is it a brie? It's kind of a running joke amongst our team and our cheesemonger friends, because if you've ever worked as a cheesemonger, you will hand somebody through that gesture, you will hand somebody basically any cheese on the counter. And one of the first questions you will hear is, "Oh, this is delicious. Is this a brie?" It's a reference point that is so powerful with the American customer that it is the reference point for interesting artisan cheese, almost like calling every copy machine a Xerox. And certainly amongst the bloomy rind family. So more accurately, we would call this a soft ripened bloomy rind cheese, which that white flora on the surface literally blooms. It gives it its name. It's based on some of those very old cheeses. I think the first instance of what is recognizable as a brie is from like the year 1000 AD. But nowadays we both embrace and sort of struggle to place Moses Sleeper as an American original cheese influenced by these traditions. We don't want to call it a brie because brie is a very specific cheese from a very specific place. The true brie. Even back then in the 30s, they were like, no, this is brie from that place in France that actual brie is made. So Moses Sleeper is not a brie, but when in describing it to somebody, we will definitely help them out and place it for them by saying, this is a brie-like cheese. This is a brie-style cheese. All right, so let's keep it moving. We've still got a little bit of ground to cover. Okay, this is interesting because it's an image of a cheese factory in Germany. And that kind of stood out to me because, as I described, Americans were really known as industrializing cheese sort of before anybody else. But there was a lot of transatlantic sharing of information about sort of best practices and how to make cheese efficiently. And a lot of those bries that are made today will say were made in pretty modern factories. It's just that our modern factories tend to make more everyday rindless cheeses. But in Europe, their factories are making natural rind, cheeses that appear to be farmhouse cheeses. So let's hear about this print.
Sure. So this is a photograph from, as you can see, 1929 by the German photographer Werner Manz, who was from Cologne. And this is a photograph of the ADA cheese factory, which was basically on the outskirts of Cologne. So this is local to him. And he, as a photographer, was particularly focused on capturing modern architecture, much like Kertész, who we saw in the previous photograph. His work was published in magazines. So, this too, I think, is one of the things that we can think of that's kind of an interesting thread of a lot of the objects that we've seen here, not only either were used in daily life, like that original, the cheese strainer, the original object we started with, or capture daily life. But a lot of the media that we're looking at here, particularly print media, was in part popular and developed as a way of connecting art to people. So not just keeping art for the clergy or royalty or the aristocracy, but in sharing art with the common people. So photography too is very much one of those popular media, and these are both photographers who are influential, who are respected, who are art photographers, but their work was also part of popular culture through publication in magazines. So here, what we see, this cheese factory, the context it plays is really about that modernist architecture. So again, there's a very strong sense of geometry. You get that not only through those angles of that very blocky building itself, but through the gate and the way it intersects in these sharp diagonals, as well as even those letters, ADA, have a very strong geometric presence here, not only as as signifiers of where we are, but as further lines, those diagonal lines, and then that kind of the only curve of the painting of that D, kind of almost right in the middle, just off center from the center of the image. So these were the kind of monumental backdrops of the modern age. Werner Manz's photographs tend to be devoid of any, human presence. There's that sense of eeriness. You see that also, I think you get that from, the clouds in the sky, that a little bit swirling around there. And indeed, I did a little bit of digging on this cheese factory, and I did find one thing about the kind of inhuman conditions, much like any factory we would think of, but the heat in the factory, the relentless speed of production, and again, I think this is one that was really populated primarily by women. So we've gone from the kind of romanticized dairy girl to, in this case, these women working in factories in these rather unpleasant conditions. And if we go on to the next slide, I just wanted to give you, just a little bit more context. So two more of Werner Manz's photographs, where you can see, again, this very, sharp modernist architecture, not only in the structures themselves that were so austere, but also in the way that the photographer captures them, that really emphasizes the angles, the plays of light and shadow, emphasize that sharpness. And then what I thought was so fun, I just found this a little while ago, is I found a couple of labels from this cheese factory. So I thought those would be fun to include, and you can see in the top one, it's a little image, but it's again a representation of that building, and the one on the bottom has that dairy maid, but looking, I don't know, rather robust. I think of her as looking rather German there in that image. So I'll let you take it away, but that I thought was an interesting. This one is not so well known. Kertész is a better known photographer, so I had some fun exploring, getting to know. That's the great thing about the Met's collection, and that's one thing that I feel so fortunate to get to do, is to explore different areas of the collection.
And before I move on, will you say the photographer's name one more time?
Werner Manz.
Werner Manz, thank you. We had a comment in the chat. All right, this center image here is what I would like you to look at as I change to the next slide, because it really mirrors the sort of appearance of this modern square cheddar. This is unusual. So I included, I really like this. This is a modern dairy plant. It's just a tangle of stainless steel, very impressive looking, very efficient. And this is the kind of facility that would generally produce these 40-pound or 640-pound blocks of cheese. And that's what the US is known for engineering, and for better or worse, sort of our iconic, square sliced cheese. So that equipment abounds, and it actually exists at a number of different scales. So there's cheeses that are made in this shape by our partners at Cabot. They make those round wheels of cloth-bound for us. It's the only round cheese they make anymore. And they make it sort of like in the middle of the night with a special crew. But more typically, they would have equipment that would make this much more efficiently. So it's a little bit more economical for us to bring in. And also, what's interesting about the square cheeses that we get from Cabot is that they sell them under their legacy collection. So they have these kind of high-end set of recipes that make these sort of interesting modern flavors. And we go with their grading team and select batches to ripen in our own cellars. So we have a cheese called Cave Age Cheddar and Vault 5, and those are two different recipes that they developed that we actually select for ripening. They spend more time with their friends ripening away at Cabot, sealed in anaerobic conditions, but still developing textures and flavors over time. They're aged a relatively long time compared to modern cheeses, which sometimes are just wrapped up and sent out for pizza or the deli after just a few days of curing. But this is just about a year old by the time it comes out, either from Cabot or from us. And that the fact that it spends more time ripening at Cabot means that we don't need to apply cloth, but we do ripen it just like the cloth bound otherwise. So it kind of spends an inverse amount of time with them and in our cave. So it's a kind of a gateway cheese that we've developed. It's a little bit easier price point than the cloth bound cheddar. You're more likely to see it in an everyday place that you would shop than in a high-end cheese counter with a monger. It's a segue cheese. So the cheese that we're trying here today is actually, we're calling it Conundrum. We made this from our own raw milk. Usually we only make pasteurized cheeses like Harbison and Moses Sleeper from our own milk, but also we'll use milk from our neighboring farms that we're able to pay a much better price for than commodity prices. And so with a pasteurized cheese, we can use others' milk. With a raw milk cheese, we only use milk from our own cows. So we brought milk from our own cows to our friends because we were doing a creamery expansion project, had milk to use. Our creamery was down. So our friends with a small scale cheddar plant, relative to how those things are, much, much smaller than what's in this picture here, invited us over to their house. We brought our milk with us and we made this raw milk cheddar using the equipment that produces the square cheese. And then, we kind of followed a similar aging path that we would when we would select cheese from Cabot. So this is like the first batch that we ever made. We're working on expanding our ability to make and ripen cheddar in the years to come. And so this is sort of a glimpse ahead down into the crystal ball of the kinds of cheeses that we're going to be working to develop in the future. And it's a way of, it's a cave-aged cheese, even though it's made with efficient technology. It's aged a long time, even though we could just wrap it up and sell it. So we're using modern technology to make a cheese more accessible to different kinds of people and to make it easier on our bodies. We have a robot in the caves brushing and turning this cheese and putting it back on the shelf. But everything that we're using technology to make it easier, but not at the expense of quality and flavor. And so I think when you taste this cheese, you can get a sense for our interest in, taking the harder route, the longer route, the more expensive route of cave aging and time spent before sale in developing these flavors. So it's definitely a modern approach and sort of a melding of modern technology. The picture in the and tradition, modern technology with these traditional techniques. So the picture in the lower right is a hay drying facility, just another example of how we use technology to keep traditional techniques viable. So in our climate, it's a lot easier to make fermented hay, those big kind of marshmallows. You can kind of see them scattered around the edge. When we have bales that aren't going to dry well, we'll wrap them up and feed them to dry cows, or we'll sell them. But for our cows making raw milk cheese, we have to feed them dry hay. And this piece of technology was actually developed for makers of Parmigiano Reggiano so that they could always have dry hay for their cows and whatever was going on in their climate. And so we were able to crop local hay instead of trucking hay in from drier regions. And that dry hay has a microbial profile that's much more suitable for raw milk cheese making than fermented hay, which isn't bad for cows. It preserves nutrients well, but it messes with raw milk cheese microbiology and compromises quality. So this is sort of like, it's an efficient new piece of technology. It has a big solar array on the top, but it's done in the name of making cheese delicious and complex and terroir driven. Okay.
I have a quick point of connection there, if I can toss it in. So
yeah,
Mons would have taken that photograph in 29, which would have been 10 years into the Bauhaus movement, which was an East German movement that is well known for architecture, but it was really about drawing together utility and aesthetics. And looking at the Calderwood cropping facility down right, that is a similar sensibility. And so another just interesting connection here is that artwork coming out of a time where there was a desire for like utility and beauty to coexist in a single work. And there's a lot of that happens in cheesemaking, both in the guts of the facilities and the look of them. The form leads to a certain kind of function, and the look is still beautiful while being functional.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so the final stop on our tour tonight is leading into the land of postmodernism. And there is an anthropologist that cheese nerds know and love, Heather Paxson at MIT, and she wrote a piece called Microbiopolitics, and in it she talks about how American farmstead cheesemaking and the new wave of artisan cheesemaking has really entered a post-Pasteurian time. And I'll talk about, what that means, but I think it plays nicely with this sort of abandonment of convention in the art world.
So I imagine this is an image that is, at least in its type, familiar to all of you. Andy Warhol, that kind of father of pop art. This is an iconic image from his Campbell's Soup series. So as you may know, Warhol's background was as a commercial illustrator, and then he began working in screen printing, which had the benefit of, this is a type, a derivative of printmaking, and that it allows him to create multiples. But for him, it was allowing him to repeat images in a variety of media and colors, and it was highlighting that detached quality of the process of printmaking, much like commercial production. So pop art is a different kind of take on the art of the everyday. So going all the way back through all of these types of, art of the everyday that we've looked at. And in fact, it was the first Campbell's Soup series in 1962, with which Warhol helped to usher in the pop art movement. This was sort of the announcement of his new style at an exhibition in Los Angeles. And he rendered each one by hand, but attempted to, in the design, but attempted to mimic the commercial item, so the print of the label of the soup cans. This is from his second series of the Campbell soup cans. And I thought it was interesting. So he was inspired to use the soup cans as this image by his friend, Muriel Lato, who was also a dealer. And she said to him that he should pick a motif that would be recognizable to everyone. So Campbell's Soup, is as recognizable as it got. And he picked out all of these kinds of different varieties. And here, right across the middle, that yellow part of the label, great as a sauce too. So this, cheddar cheese, that's like very iconic, basic staple again of the American diet. And one thing that I love about what Warhol said about his work that I think resonates here and with this discussion is, he said, you need to let the little things that would ordinarily bore you suddenly thrill you. So this is his take on taking something that's so mundane as, this item ubiquitous in American grocery stores, cheddar cheese soup, nothing, fancy about that. And taking it into the realm of fine art, making it a thrill. And in part as a series, as you probably know, often Warhol's works are exhibited in kind of bulk, and they create that same sort of impact, like going down the aisles of a supermarket. So from an iconic image of pop art here to, next slide, please. So one that I won't keep on the screen for too long because I don't want to ruin your appetite. But I think this is a really fun work of art too. This is the last object that we're going to talk about. So this is a sculpture by the American living artist, Robert Gober. And in the 1990s, Gober took archetypal subjects, particularly associated with nostalgic mid-20th century domesticity. So again, the same kinds of subjects in many ways that interested Warhol. Although he also looked at, so here of course we have cheese. He also did things with butter and donuts and gin, so food, the food and wine genre, but also like house paint and light bulbs and rat poison. I don't know why rat poison has shown up in a couple of different series if we think back to the Karachi drawings turned prints. But a similar kind of thing, looking at a variety of these kind of objects that signify daily life. But what Gober did, so totally different. This has that surrealist impulse. Gober is taking those, very day-to-day objects, and he's making them strange and kind of making us queasy through particularly allusions to the body in pieces. So here he takes that very standard looking yellow tinged cheese wedge with its, air bubble holes, but he adds hair growing from the rind of the cheese, thus short-haired cheese. Apparently this was taken from one of his studio assistants. So a rather bizarre image here, and thinking all the way back to the that Salvador Dali Persistence of Memory painting that perhaps you'll never see in quite the same way now that you can think of those melting clocks as camembert cheese. I think, it's interesting to see how cheese has not only that interest for kind of the day-to-day subject matter, the staples of life or the indulgences of life, but also has this way of lending itself towards the surrealist impulse, some things that are strange. I think that comes from, the kind of evolving textures and the variety of flavors and a little bit of the sense of imagination that goes into all those varieties of cheese. I thought that this was also a nice object to end with because this is one of the most recent additions to the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. So this is the latest object in time of creation that we have in our selection today, but also the most recent addition to the collection. So this was a gift in honor of the museum's 150th anniversary last year by a generous donor, Aaron Fleischman. So again, as I mentioned, our anniversary at the beginning, and the way that much like the history of cheese, the history of the museum continues always to evolve. Our collections evolve, expand in new kinds of ways. And so I wanted to close my portion here with a quote from the really brilliant, articulate critic Hilton Alls, who said, Gober's food is about the impermanence of things we take into ourselves and turn into something else. Energy, the memory of a taste with that machine known as our body. So I thought, much as this image we can click off of it if it puts you off of your appetite a little bit, I thought that quote might stimulate your senses a little bit. And I'll hand it back over to you to talk about the cheese pairing, but thank you all.
Oh, I love it. It's so creepy and actually sort of impressive that with non-food items, he was able to really make very realistic cheese that truly looks like it's growing here. And as a cheesemonger, when I do education for cheesemongers and not for the public, we tend to get into a little bit of real talk. Like we really talk about like how cows' bodies work and about the nitty gritty of microbiology, which we'll see a little bit on this slide here. And we start like real talk, like this isn't what you're going to use to sell the cheese, but it is, how you might understand it. So I think that image for me also just symbolizes the kind of like the realness and the bodily functions associated with cheesemaking that we do discuss in great detail behind the scenes. So I wanted to circle back to Heather Paxton's notion of post-Pasteurian times of cheesemaking. So when Louis Pasteur here discovered the approach that is pasteurization of keeping food safer through exposing, in this case, milk to heat, to really cut down on the number of microbes that you're starting with at the beginning of cheese making. It saved a lot of lives. We were trying to truck milk around into cities in the middle of the 1800s before refrigeration technology. And like tainted milk was a leading cause of infant mortality. It was bad news. So we really needed Louis to come along and figure out what microbes were. And when you discover something like, microbiology in this way, and that it's in your food, it's sort of a terrifying reality. Like, you're surrounded by all of these invisible forces and they might make you sick. And of course, when you realize that, the impulse is to eliminate them. And then, okay, yeah, we'll like pick this one out that makes sourdough. We'll keep this one that makes beer ferment, and this one that makes lactose turn into lactic acid, and get cheese making started. So it's sort of like guilty until proven innocent approach, which is understandable considering what we understood at the time. We're at a point where we are in our sort of postmodern world, understanding and appreciating the unknown, the lack of like a central truth of goodness, and the benefit of having diversity and creating complexity in our worlds, in our ecosystems, in our food that might be a little bit beyond what we can comprehend, but it makes it better. It makes life richer. It makes food more delicious. And so the thinking about microbes in food these days, fermented foods are booming. The craft food movement is really on the rise. People are returning to these old traditions and trying to look up old recipes and figure out what food was like a long time ago before we had sort of cleaned up our act, microbially speaking. And so this chart on the bottom left was from years of research by two of our friends, Dr. Ben Wolf and Dr. Rachel Dutton, who had a DNA sequencer and were using cheese rinds to study how microbial communities form and how microbes sort of communicate with each other and form a successional environment. So this is sort of a taxonomical chart of 137 different cheese rinds. And this was all of the different, each color represents a different sort of family of microbes that they found, or a different type of microbe, either, separated between fungi and bacteria. So that's a whole semester's worth of work to understand, but I think this just expresses in sort of a beautiful, almost artistic way, the diversity of cheese microbiology that leads to complexity. And with the tools that we have at hand in a modern cheesemaking facility, we can really understand that diversity is generally good, and that there's, instead of 3 or 4 good guys, there's like 3 or 4 bad guys, and the rest are good or neutral. So we've narrowed it down to like 4 pathogens of concern, and we screen our milk, our land, our cows, our cheese, the floor drains, finished product, for those 4 pathogens of concern that can make it through the selective pressure gauntlet that we've created with cheesemaking, that salting, the dehydrating, the acidifying, and the aging. We've set up a really tough obstacle course that really makes cheese safe. It's what's been making cheese safe to eat for millennia. And then we've identified the 4 that can make it through that obstacle course, and we monitor our environment in order to ensure that none of them make it to the finish line, or even into the process to begin with. And so it's quite safe and reliable, especially with these modern tools, to adapt these ancient practices to a food that is supposed to be delicious, with deliciousness as the ultimate goal for the implementation of the technology in order to support our rural landscape. Small farms in Vermont can't participate in the commodity market. There's too much milk on the market for them to make a living with 50 cows. If you can turn your milk into something more valuable, you can give your local working landscape a shot. And that's what cheese has been about since the very beginning. It's about figuring out how to work in and on the land in a way that works for the people there, and the animals and the environment, hopefully. Okay, so we have just a couple minutes left here. If there's any burning questions from those of you who tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in. And like I said, Laura, thank you so much for joining us. I hope this was as interesting for you as it was for us.
Yes, I learned so much. That's fantastic. My quest for cheese in my diet is forever enhanced by all of this fantastic information. And it's always fun to look at cheese and art. So I hope that, many of you will get to visit the Met and go on your own little quest for cheese in our galleries. As you've seen, I think the objects we chose today come from 6 different curatorial departments out of 17, which is basically a way of saying like 6 totally different parts of the museum. So come enjoy and go on your own little quest. I always think it's kind of fun to do a scavenger hunt, pick a topic. And as you can see, cheese is a fruitful one.
All right. At least one person out there wishes this could have gone on longer. So I'm glad that they hung in there with us, and there's still over 100 people tuned in. So I'm just so pleased that we have such a network of friends out there who are with us on this journey of learning more and understanding cheese as an observer of human culture through time, which I have to credit Sam for coming up with. Thank you, Sam, for being there for me, both in helping with research and pep talk.
You're a superhero. You got this.
All right, Laura, when things are normal, we'd love to have you come up and show you around.
I'd love to, and I've been very much enjoying my cheese. So thank you for that. It's been delightful, and I will absolutely take you up on a visit when things get more normal. Thank you all for being here, for listening.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great night.